In this video, we're going to talk about operators, expressions, and statements. If I can make a quick equation of what I mean by operators, expressions, and statements, if you think back to your literary or English classes where you had to parse out sentences and you'd have your nouns and you'd have your verbs and you have your adverbs, adjectives, you have your phrases and things of that nature, they roughly equate to what we're talking about here. For example, a statement is basically a sentence. An expression is a phrase, and an operator can be one of these things like nouns or verbs or a very small part of what makes up an entire statement. So just like you probably don't think of sentences that you type or whenever you speak, you don't think of them in terms of your English classes and using phrases and participles and things of that nature. Once I teach you about operators, expressions, and statements, you won't need to think about them either. They'll just be part of what you do. But it's important as we begin software development that you understand the different pieces that make up an entire, what we call, line of code, an executable line of code. So let's start with operators. What are operators? Well, they basically allow you to do different things. Like in the case of arithmetic operators, you have the ability to add and subtract, multiply, divide, cube, get the modular value of, and so on for numeric values. And they're represented by the plus symbol, the minus symbol, the little star symbol represents multiply, and so on. There's also concatenation operators, so that you can add strings of text together, and you can use either the plus symbol or the ampersand symbol to do that. Then there's also comparison operators, and that's like your equal, your greater than, your less than, your greater or equal to, your less than or equal to, and then also you have the two brackets next to each other, which means it does not equal. And then finally you have your logical operators, and those are things like the and or, and also an or else. And I'll show you some examples of those later on in this video. So let's go on to expressions. If you take a look at the VB help, it's not a lot of help. An expression can be thought of as a series of value representing elements separated by operators that yields a new value. Examples of such value representing elements are literals, variables, or other expressions and function calls, the operators, blah, 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 blah. Let's make this pretty simple. Basically, an expression is 5 plus 6. An expression is x plus y. An expression is Scott and blank space and McFarland. An expression is x dot toString and space and convert string x plus y. And then there's also an expression that equates to a value. In other words, x is greater than y. That's either true or it's false. It can't be both, in the case of computer programming anyway. So these are all examples of expressions. Now, basically statements are made up of keywords, operators, variables, like we talked about before, constants, which we haven't talked about, and expressions. And so there's a bunch of different types of statements or types of, in other words, lines of code that you can create. You can create a declaration statement, and that's all that is what we talked about before, dim x as integer. And then there's assignment statements where x equals 7, or x equals x plus 1, or x equals x dot toString plus space plus Scott plus McFarland. Or it can be an executable statement, which are things like if-then-else statements, calling other functions, and so on. And we'll get into all those as time goes on. So basically, when we think of statements, we need to understand that each statement is a command to the compiler, to the .NET framework. And each statement can be on its own line, or it can be combined with other lines using a colon. So you can actually write an entire application on one line of code if you really want to do that, and if you really want to make your other coworkers mad at you. Each statement can be on one line, or it can span multiple lines. If you have a very long line of code, the convention is to split it up into multiple lines of code But in VisualBasic.net, you must use the underscore character at the end of each line in order to make it all apply to the same command or statement. And we'll show an example of that in just a moment. And basically, what are statements? Well, statements are what makes your program your program. It makes it do interesting things. And you combine a bunch of statements, or in other words, a bunch of commands, or in other words, a bunch of lines of code, and all of a sudden, you have an application that does your evil bidding. Okay, so what I've done was create a little code snippet that allows us to take a look at the things we just discussed. And the first thing we did was talk about statements, and so here we have declaration statements. Basically, this just means that I've made some dimensions, some variables. Dim x is integer, dim name is string, dim b is boolean. Okay. The other type of statement is an assignment statement. We have several examples of that. X equals 50, y equals 20. These are both assignment statements. Here we have a little bit more complex assignment statement where z equals the product of x plus y, x minus y, x times y, and so on. And I've also got another version of that where name is assigned the value of Steve plus space plus Jaworski. Okay. These also play double duty because I can show you the use of the operators. Here's the plus operator, the minus operator, the multiply operator, and the divide operator. Here's the modulus operator. And then from a concatenation operator standpoint, we show both of them here. The plus, where I'm able to concatenate Steve and the space, blank space, and then use the ampersand to also append on the last name Jaworski. Then there's the use of the logical operators. Now, if you're like me, I only use one, maybe two of these, and not all of them. They can be a little bit confusing, and usually I structure my code a little bit differently so I can avoid using them. That's kind of shame on me, but you know, you probably should know these. So the first one I'm going to show you is the use of the not logical operator. And in this case, 23 greater than 67, not, that makes B true, because 23 is not greater than 67. Is 23 less than 67? Not. Well, because the not's in there, that makes this value false. Because, indeed, 23 is less than 67. So that's the use of the not operator. The next is the use of the and operator, which means both values have to be true in order for B to be true. Now, in this case, 5 is greater than 1, and 23 greater than 67? No. So that makes B false. That's different than the OR operator, which means either one can be true, and this would become true. So in this case, 23 greater than 67? Nope. But 5 is greater than 1, therefore B is true. Then we move on to some of the more complex ones, like the XOR statement, which means one or the other must be true, but not both of the statements, or both of the expressions. So in this case, we have 23 greater than 67? No. But is 5 greater than 1? Yes. Therefore, B is true. Now, in this case, is 67 greater than 23? Yes. Or 5 greater than 1? Yes. Therefore, this becomes false. Because either one or the other, but not both of them, can be true. That's why it returned false. The and also statement is basically where you make an evaluation on the first statement, and it determines whether you should even bother running the second statement. So if the first expression is false, then don't even bother evaluating or running the second expression. So in this case, we do 23 greater than 67. Well, since this returns false, we assign B the value of false, and never even attempt to run my function. My function makes a call to code in another part of my application. This is covered more extensively in an upcoming video on procedures for functions and sub-procedures and things of that nature. But at any rate, let's go on to the other use of the and also and take a look at the opposite case. 67 is greater than 23. That's true. Therefore, also now run my function, which my function does return the value of true, and therefore B is true, because both of them equate to true. On the opposite side of the spectrum is the or else, which means if the first expression is true, don't bother evaluating or running the second expression. So since 67 is greater than 23, B is true, don't even bother running my function. In this case, 23 is not greater than 67, therefore run my function. My function returns true, and therefore B is true. Let's go on to a third type of statement, which is the executable statement. Executable statements are things like evaluations and if-then statements. There also can be calls to functions like the console.writeLine function like we did a little while ago. And this also doubles as an example of a comparison operator where we have if x is greater than y, then do one thing, otherwise do something else. Now the if-then-else statement structure is something we're going to come to in about 2 videos from now. Don't worry about that for the time being. But what we want to focus on is the use of the comparison operator, which compares x and y to see which one's greater. And then finally, we talked about multiple statements being on one line. So this is a statement. It's an assignment statement. Here's another assignment statement. And then what kind of a statement is this? It's an executable statement. So all 3 of these statements are on one line of code. Now, quite frankly, you shouldn't use this convention unless you have an absolutely great reason why you're doing it, because it will annoy other programmers to no end. And we also talked about one statement being on multiple lines. So, for example, I have name equals, and I have a bunch of concatenation operators concatenating together the word Mr. and a space, and Dirk and a space, and Nowitzki and a space, and a comma Esquire. And notice how I did this and made this all on one line. If I were to take away this and this, notice what happens. I get some blue squiggly lines, which says syntax error, expression expected. The underscore means that all of these statements, even though they're on separate lines, they all belong together. Now this is different than JavaScript or C#, where you can put multiple one statement on multiple lines, and there's no continuation character per se, but what you have instead is the use of the semicolon, which you don't have in Visual Basic. That is what denotes whether something is finished, a statement is finished or not. So at any rate, that pretty much sums up our discussion of operators and expressions and statements. Quite frankly, I know this stuff's a little bit boring, but it's important that you understand it, if for no other reason than from a theoretical standpoint. It helps you parse apart the different pieces of expression, and so when you start typing things like, X on a line, and you say, well, why does that have expression is not a method, and why did it put those things around it? You can start diagnosing why that's true. Well, why is it true? Because X is not a function, it's not a method, and therefore it can't be by itself there. So when you start to understand those kinds of things and the structure of a line of code, it helps you as you begin to write your lines of code. Just like it helps you to understand how to write better sentences and construct better paragraphs whenever you learn the rules of English. So I hope that this lesson was beneficial, if not for any other reason, but from a theoretical standpoint. Thank you.